I'm Wayne Parham of Police Magazine, and this is Coffee Break with Police Experts, Critical Incident Response Series sponsored by Axon.
You can't predict when a critical incident will occur, but you can be more prepared. From virtual reality training and LTE body cameras to real-time crime centers and drone live streaming, Axon's ecosystem of connected technology services and partnerships is designed to better support first responders before, during, and after the call. But at the heart of every incident is safety. So Axon's Officer Safety Plan bundles the latest and greatest technology for officers to protect themselves and their communities, including taser energy weapons, body cameras, digital evidence management, and more. Plus, with the Officer Safety Plan, you get access to time-saving tools and features like records management, redaction and transcription, and third-party video playback. With Axon, everyone is better protected when everything's connected. Visit axon.com/policemag to learn more.
Today, we're joined by Jim Whitfield. Jim is a retired Mississippi State Department of Health Emergency Response Coordinator and the current Sunflower County, Mississippi Deputy Fire Coordinator. He is certified as a hazardous materials technician, a radiation hazmat specialist, and is also a nationally registered EMT. Jim teaches a hazardous materials for law enforcement course at a state police academy in Moorhead, Mississippi. Thank you for being here with us today, Jim.
Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate it.
Jim, first off, can you just explain to us why it's important for police officers to learn about hazardous materials?
Absolutely. First and foremost, it's a requirement. Emergency responders that are likely to encounter hazardous materials incidents need to be trained for their level of response. OSHA has requirements that come from federal codes, and it gets kind of deep to quote all that. But basically, firefighters, EMTs, police officers need hazardous materials training that would be consistent with what their expected roles are on the scene. Certainly, police officers, we don't expect to get hands-on with hazardous materials. So their level of training would be slightly less than that of, say, hazardous materials technicians or even specialists. On a day-to-day basis, hazmat's all around us. It may be industrial, it may be commercial or retail, certainly in transportation, which is going to be key for law enforcement, work in motor vehicle accidents, things like that, and even illicit use, people stealing chemicals for drug manufacturing and things like that. So an officer can expect to encounter hazardous materials at some point in their career. It may not be an everyday thing, but certainly they may run into it a few times over the course of a 20, 30, 40-year career. The awareness level training that we're doing with our officers here gives them the knowledge that they need to start or initiate that response. Officers typically are going to be first on scene before firefighters and EMTs and others. So having them with a base level of knowledge of how to properly set up the scene, set up exclusion areas, don't let anybody in. That's going to be critical for us as hazardous materials personnel and later incident managers to come in and continue that incident. That first wave, that first contact that officer has, making sure they make the right decisions early is important.
And I know you train the officer to an awareness level. I know there are multiple levels, but can you get a little more into the awareness level? What kind of things they will learn to do?
Sure. We'll start just to let you know there's 4 levels of hazardous materials training or certification. Awareness, operations, hazardous materials technicians, and then hazardous materials specialists. And each of those levels is builds on the previous. You don't just jump in as a technician. We all go through awareness. We all go through operations. Awareness level is exactly what it sounds like. It gives the officer, the EMT, firefighter, the basic information needed to understand where hazardous materials can be found in their community, where we may expect them to be, whether it be in a retail setting or otherwise. An industry is pretty obvious. Transportation is pretty obvious, but where might we find hazardous materials otherwise? How to recognize those, both locations where to anticipate finding them, and then how to recognize that hazardous materials are involved, whether it be through placards, whether it be through signage, whether it be through other means that we can visually identify. And then awareness level personnel, awareness level trained personnel, I should say, have the information they need to start setting up defensive perimeters. In other words, I know where the release is occurring. I can set up a perimeter 1,000 feet away or 500 feet away, and then deny entry to others. That is what awareness level training is. Then as you go on, the others take in more skill, more responsibility, more knowledge about how to actually prosecute that incident to make sure that we can stop the leak or mitigate it further. But awareness is just that very first responder, how to set up the scene for us as we come in later.
And Jim, a minute ago, you mentioned placards. Can you explain a little bit about placards? I know the ERG guide and also the NFPA Diamond, which is hard to get into the depth of that, but can you explain a little bit about how officers can use those two resources?
In transportation and in fixed facilities, we placard or label hazardous materials in a way that makes it easily identifiable through color coding, through numbers, and I'll talk briefly about that. But one of my instructors, a guy named Tom Clausen out of Idaho, who did my radiation specialist, probably has the best description I've ever heard. It says of a skunk. You think about a skunk, black with white stripes. He has a visual clue that says, hey, something here you need to pay attention to. And that's exactly what a placard is. The diamond-shaped placard on a transportation truck, a tanker or something like that, is the stripe on the skunk. For a fixed facility, the NFPA 704 diamond, which is a little different from what we see in transportation, again, is that stripe on the skunk. And it allows us to see and understand hazardous materials are present. They can convey to the responders a lot of information about what substances may be involved, what risks may be present. The DOT, the transportation placards, are color coded. They're red for flammability. They're green for gases and other things like that. So even if we can't tell anything else, we can get some information from the color. The 704 diamond that you referenced earlier is found on fixed facilities. While it doesn't allow us to identify the actual chemical involved, it does allow us to get a general sense of risk in terms of flammability, health hazards, reactivity. Does it react to water or other substances, things like that. So anytime we see those two placards, again, think about that skunk. That's the stripes on the skunk. And if we continue that skunk analogy, we see it, but if we choose to come into contact, or we can even be exposed without coming into contact with it, right? You smell a skunk, you've been exposed to it. And if you get closer to it, you're getting more risk of exposure. And then certainly if you do get contaminated, you can spread that contamination to the others. So those placards are the stripes on the skunk that say, hey, stop what you're doing. Let's take a look at things before we get too far involved.
So they don't have to have detailed knowledge, but just back to awareness to look and use as a resource
Exactly right.
Determine potential threats.
Exactly right. Correct.
And there again, we have one of those ERG downloadable. So really any officer could put that on their phone.
Absolutely. I strongly recommend the Department of Transportation's Emergency Response Guidebook. It's available as an app, both for iPhone and for Android devices. As you're traveling down the road, you see a placard on a 18-wheeler or other transport vehicle. You can easily look up what substances are involved, and then the protective action measures, whether it's primarily a fire hazard or a health hazard, and the things you need to do, isolation distance and stuff like that, all available right there in your hand on your phone. Highly recommended.
And again, it's a free download, so why not?
Sure.
Why not take advantage of it?
Exactly.
Well, with all you teach, what are the key takeaways that an officer needs to keep in mind? And once they get done, what's that key element you want them to take back out into the field?
For me, and this gets a little bit into some detail, but responder safety. I have people at home that like to see me come home every day, and I have to make my decisions on emergency responses that make sure that I'm going to come home. So responder safety is paramount. If we get involved, if I go to an incident and become part of that incident in a negative way, then I've exponentially complicated the situation unnecessarily. If I get exposed to hazardous materials or something, now we may have gone from an incident that is relatively okay, but now I've got someone involved, and now I've got a public safety person involved. So it makes life a lot more difficult on incident managers. Recognize, especially as police, recognize when and where hazardous materials might be in your daily routine, in your patrol area. Understand that as an officer, the equipment you've got in your cruiser may or may not give you much protection. More than likely, probably not any protection at all, or at least a minor amount. That, don't overcommit yourself. It's hard for us as responders to slow down, to stop and evaluate. We want to get in, especially when we see people hurting. We want to get in and help them, but with hazardous materials, you risk bringing that back to yourself, back to your coworkers, and back to your family. So in any potential hazardous material incident, understand your limitations and stick to them. Do not try to overdo your abilities that may or may not exist.
Very good advice. What about, let's say we have a police officer, training officer, chief that wants to learn a little bit more. What kind of resources can they turn to, either online, government, state or federal level, or, local fire, EMA? Where are some good resources where they can learn more about responding to hazmat calls?
Well, I'll say this, understanding that we're in an online format, our discussion today and the distribution, but online training can be quality. There is good training out there, but by the same token, there's some training that may or may not be as good of a quality. So be mindful of that. With that said, your local fire department, your city or your county emergency management agency is a good place to start. Just like all public safety agencies, we differ based on our community. Some are far more robust than others. Some may have hazardous materials people on staff that can help you out. Most may not, actually. If your county has it's kind of a technical term, a local emergency planning committee, an LEPC. That's a joint effort between emergency planners and hazardous materials industries or hazardous materials carrying industries of how to come up with a community's hazardous materials plans. If that committee exists in your community, excellent resource. They're local. They know what's local. If all else fails, your state emergency management agency, your state fire training academy can also put you on a good path to training opportunities as well.
Oh, sounds like a good plan. Good plan all the way around. Anything else you'd like to add in?
Hazardous materials can be a deep topic, and it can get very technical very quickly. And I don't say that for myself, because as technicians, we still respond with the very basics. We start with that emergency response guidebook, then we start looking at other things. But making sure that people understand their limitations and not to exceed those limitations in that initial phase of the response, as officers are going to be involved in those initial phases. That is, to me, the most important, because I want that police officer to go home at night, that state trooper, that deputy sheriff, to make sure that they go back to their family without any short-term or long-term effects because they inadvertently became exposed to something when they didn't have to. If they had taken time to understand isolation distances, look it up in the ERG, and then abide by that, we'll do well.
Good. Well, Jim, thank you again for sharing your expertise, and thank you as well to Axon for sponsoring Coffee Break with Police Experts, critical incident response series, and continue doing your part to keep people safe out there, Jim.
Certainly, man. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks.